On an ordinary day in November 1996, Indira Gandhi International Airport in India was full of travelers like any other day. The weather was clear, the sky calm, and everything seemed normal. On the airport apron, passengers of Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763 were preparing for departure. It was a massive Boeing 747, carrying more than 300 people on board. At the same time, a giant Kazakh cargo aircraft, an Ilyushin Il-76, was approaching from a distance, preparing to land at the same airport, with 37 people on board, most of them traders heading to India. These two aircraft were never supposed to meet. Each was supposed to follow its own safe flight path, and there were people whose job was to make sure that happened. But on that day, something went wrong. Something small, maybe even a trivial mistake. Yet because of it, that quiet day turned within minutes into the deadliest mid-air collision in aviation history. What made the story unforgettable was not only the scale of the tragedy, but also the man who appeared in the final seconds and did something that made people call him the Savior to this day. On November 12, 1996, as the sun was setting over New Delhi, Indira Gandhi International Airport was crowded as usual. The sky was clear with a few light clouds, and the weather was ideal for flying. In the middle of this calm atmosphere, a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 was preparing for Flight 763, heading from New Delhi to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. On board were 312 people, passengers and crew combined. The crew consisted of 23 members, while most of the passengers were Indian migrant workers, about 215 people, leaving their families and homeland behind to travel to Saudi Arabia, the land of opportunity, to work, earn a living, and build a better future for their children. Some were returning to their jobs after vacation. Others were traveling abroad for the first time in their lives, carrying all their dreams and hopes in their luggage. In addition to the Indian passengers, there were travelers of other nationalities on board. 9 from Nepal, 3 from Pakistan, 2 from the United States, 1 from Bangladesh, 1 from the United Kingdom, along with several Saudi passengers. In the cockpit sat Captain Khalid Al-Shubaili, a 45-year-old Saudi pilot with around 10,000 flight hours. He was known for his extreme professionalism, attention to detail, high moral character, and strong faith, something everyone who worked with him testified to. The painful irony was that Captain Khalid was not even supposed to be the captain of this flight. At that stage of his career, his main role was administrative and training related, as he had become director of pilot training, but something happened that changed the course of his life forever. Flight 763 was the return leg from India to Saudi Arabia. The outbound flight had taken the crew to India, where they were supposed to stay overnight before flying back. Just 24 hours before departure from Saudi Arabia, the originally scheduled captain had a family emergency. His daughter suddenly became ill and was hospitalized, forcing him to withdraw from the trip. The airline struggled to find a replacement on such short notice. When no one was available, Captain Khalid volunteered to cover for his colleague and save the situation. He put on his uniform and went to the airport to command a flight that was never planned for him. Beside him in the cockpit was his first officer, Captain Nazir Khan, an American of Pakistani origin, along with flight engineer Ahmed Idris. A professional crew, fully prepared for what they expected to be a routine flight, one they had flown hundreds of times before. The flight departed and arrived in India safely. Now it was time for the return journey. At the same moment the Saudi aircraft was preparing to depart, a giant beast was approaching from the north, cutting through Indian airspace toward the same airport. It was a Kazakh cargo aircraft, an Ilyushin Il-76, operating Flight 1907. Originally designed for military purposes, the aircraft was huge, heavy, and capable of carrying massive loads. Despite being a cargo plane, it carried 37 people that day, 10 crew members and 27 passengers, mostly traders traveling to India to buy goods. The composition of the Kazakh crew was different from Western crews. The aircraft commander was Captain Alexander Cherepanov, a 44-year-old Russian pilot with 9,000 flight hours, experienced and familiar with the route. But the key issue, the critical factor that would soon unlock the disaster, was communication. The Kazakh crew did not fully master English, the official language of global aviation. They relied almost entirely on one crew member, the radio operator, Igor Rapp. Igor acted as the link between the cockpit and air traffic control, receiving instructions in English and translating them for the captain and the crew. The problem was that even Igor's English was, at best, weak to intermediate. In the control tower at Indira Gandhi International Airport sat Indian Air Traffic Controller VK Duda, a 42-year-old with significant experience. He was responsible for managing all aircraft movements in the area, up to an altitude of 5,800 meters. Unfortunately, Duda was working with outdated equipment. His radar screens were old-generation systems that showed aircraft only as glowing dots, with no information about altitude or speed. To know an aircraft's altitude, the pilot had to report it verbally, and Duda had to record it manually. The system relied entirely on hearing and trust. The bigger problem, however, was not just the equipment. The airport was operating with a single civilian air corridor. Departing aircraft faced arriving aircraft head-on. The only separation between them was altitude. Most other air corridors were reserved for the Indian Air Force, turning civilian traffic into a two-way road with no physical separation. Even so, Duda was doing his best with what he had, issuing clear instructions to maintain a safe vertical separation of 300 meters between aircraft. But he had no way to verify whether pilots were actually following those instructions. At 6:32 p.m. local time, the Saudi aircraft was cleared for takeoff. The giant plane rolled down the runway and lifted smoothly into the sky, heading west towards Saudi Arabia. Minutes after takeoff, communication was handed over from the main control tower to approach control, under Duda's responsibility. From that moment, Captain Khalid and his crew began receiving direct instructions from him. First, they were instructed to climb to 10,000 feet, which they did. Shortly after, they were told to climb to 14,000 feet. And again, Captain Khalid and his crew followed the instructions precisely. Once they reached the assigned altitude, they reported back, and Duda instructed them to maintain their current level and await further instructions. At the same time, the Kazakh aircraft was beginning its gradual descent. It was flying at 23,000 feet when it started receiving descent instructions. The first order was to descend to 15,000 feet. Radio operator Igor Rapp received the instruction in English, acknowledged it, and confirmed receipt. On paper, everything was perfect. The Saudi aircraft at 14,000 feet, the Kazakh aircraft at 15,000 feet, a safe separation of 1,000 feet, about 300 meters, fully compliant with international aviation rules. But inside the Kazakh cockpit, things were not as controlled. Although Igor received the message, it seems it was not clearly understood or properly conveyed to the rest of the crew. Possibly Igor himself misunderstood it. Instead of leveling off at 15,000 feet, the aircraft continued descending, silently crossing the safety barrier without anyone fully realizing the magnitude of the mistake. As a precaution, Duda sent another message to the Kazakh aircraft, warning them of opposing traffic ahead. He told them there was a Saudi Boeing 747 at 14,000 feet, 22 kilometers away. Igor again acknowledged the message. From Duda's perspective, there was no reason to suspect anything was wrong. His radar showed two dots approaching each other but at different altitudes, and the additional warning should have been more than sufficient. What Duda did not know was that this warning likely caused confusion inside the Kazakh cockpit. Due to their limited English, when the crew heard 14,000 feet at the end of the message, they mistakenly believed this was the altitude they were supposed to descend to, instead of 15,000 feet. The last number they heard stuck in their minds. As a result, the captain continued descending, believing he was complying with instructions. As they descended, the aircraft entered a thick cloud layer, forcing them to continue descending until they were flying below the altitude of the Saudi aircraft. Had they stayed there, the disaster might have been avoided. But the Kazakh captain noticed on his instruments that he had descended too far. So he corrected the mistake and began climbing again to reach what he believed was the correct altitude. Inside the dense clouds, visibility was nearly zero. Neither crew could see the other aircraft. They relied entirely on instruments and air traffic control. On board the Saudi aircraft, there was no warning system alerting them to the deadly danger approaching at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. On the Kazakh aircraft, in the final seconds, radio operator Igor suddenly realized the scale of the disaster. He may have seen the Saudi plane emerging from the clouds and began shouting warnings to his crew, but it was too late. At the same moment, Captain Khalid al-Shubaili realized what was about to happen. There was no time for any maneuver to avoid the collision. In a calm voice he said, "I seek forgiveness from God. There is no God but God," and recited the declaration of faith. Seconds later, the collision occurred. The right wing of the Kazakh aircraft slammed into the tail of the Saudi plane, ripping it off completely. At the same time, the Kazakh wing tore apart, igniting its fuel tanks. In an instant, Both aircraft turned into a massive fireball, visible from kilometers away. At exactly 6:40 p.m., over a small village called Charki Dadri west of New Delhi, an American Air Force pilot named Timothy Black witnessed the catastrophe from above. Flying at a higher altitude, he saw a huge flash of fire burst from the clouds and described the scene as people falling from the sky like rain. He immediately radioed air traffic control to report what he had seen. That was when Duda realized the disappearance of both aircraft from radar was not a technical glitch, but the moment 349 lives were lost. Amid the destruction and death, Captain Khalid al-Shubaili wrote an extraordinary story of heroism in the final seconds of his life. When he realized the doomed aircraft was heading directly toward the village of Charki Dadri and would crash into homes, causing a massive civilian disaster, he refused to surrender to shock and despair. With every ounce of strength and experience he had, he managed to alter the burning aircraft's trajectory as it fell from the sky at terrifying speed, steering it away from the residential area. He succeeded in diverting the plane so that it crashed into empty farmland nearby, saving an entire village from annihilation, witnessed by dozens of villagers who later gave him the title, the Savior. The wreckage of both aircraft was scattered over a vast area. Due to its size and speed, the Saudi aircraft hit the ground almost vertically like a missile. The impact carved a crater 3 meters deep, burying the cockpit completely underground. Rescue teams spent days digging just to reach it. A few passengers were initially found alive, 2 from the Saudi plane and 3 from the Kazakh plane, but their injuries were fatal, and they died before reaching the hospital. By the morning of November 13th, rescue teams and the Indian Army began collecting the victims' remains. Villagers helped however they could, but fires continued burning in parts of the Saudi aircraft for 3 full days. Recovering the Saudi cockpit was the most difficult task. When it was finally extracted days later, investigators were shocked to find Captain Khalid's body almost intact, with only minor bruises. Even his beard was untouched, and the small Quran in his pocket was not burned, despite the aircraft being reduced to molten metal. Investigators eventually recovered the black boxes. To ensure neutrality, Saudi Arabia sent its recorders to the United Kingdom, while Kazakhstan sent theirs to Moscow. The data conclusively showed that the Saudi crew had followed instructions perfectly, communicated professionally in standard aviation English, and bore no responsibility. All attention turned to the Kazakh aircraft. The recordings revealed that the radio operator misunderstood the controller's instructions due to poor English, causing the fatal descent. The Indian controller was cleared of blame, having issued correct instructions. The final report also highlighted systemic failures, including the lack of altitude displaying radar and the use of a single air corridor for both arrivals and departures. After the investigation, Captain Khalid al-Shubaili's story became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and professionalism. International investigators praised him and his crew. One senior investigator said pilots of that caliber had become rare. His legacy inspired his family, especially his son Ahmed, who later left his studies to follow his father's path and become a pilot himself. The disaster, despite its horror, transformed aviation worldwide, leading to stricter English proficiency requirements, mandatory collision avoidance systems, and safer airspace management. The blood of 349 people became the heavy price paid so that the skies could become safer for millions of travelers around the world.